Ladies and gentlemen, the President of Texas A&M University, Dr. R. Bowen Lofton.
Howdy. Love you guys. It's my honor to welcome all of you, and especially our distinguished guests from the United States of America and from the state of Kuwait, to our campus this evening. I ask you all to please join me in standing as the color guard of our Corps cadets posts the colors of the United States of America and of the state of Kuwait. And please remain standing for the national anthems of both Kuwait and the United States. Thank you. Please be seated. We have gathered here today to celebrate the 20th anniversary of an extraordinary event that changed the course of human history, the liberation of Kuwait as a result of the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991. Today, 2 decades later, the world continues to owe a debt of gratitude to those whose leadership made possible the liberation of Kuwait. Foremost among these leaders stands one man, President George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States. Texas A&M University is proud to be the home of the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, which chronicles the legacy of this great president and underscores the extent to which his legacy has shaped events around the world today. Texas A&M is also proud to be the home of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, which prepares our students to perpetuate President Bush's commitment not just to public policy, but to public service, to the values of leadership, excellence, loyalty, respect, integrity, and selfless service that define this great president and our great university. Serving as Dean of the Bush School is Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Prior to Ambassador Crocker joining Texas A&M University last year, he was literally on the front lines of the United States diplomatic policy for more than 3 decades. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ryan C. Crocker.
Howdy, Aggies. It's often been said that one picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, this evening you're going to hear several thousand words, but before we get to that, we wanted to show you a few important pictures. So what we're going to do now is play an original, never-before-screened video of the entire period of the Gulf War, from invasion to liberation, narrated by the 41st President of the United States. So if we could please roll that video.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, following negotiations and promises by Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, not to use force, a powerful Iraqi army invaded its trusting and much weaker neighbor, Kuwait. Within 3 days, 120,000 Iraqi troops with 850 tanks had poured into Kuwait and moved south to threaten Saudi Arabia. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. No one, friend or foe, should doubt our desire for peace, and no one should underestimate our determination to confront aggression. Our objectives in the Persian Gulf are clear, our goals defined and familiar. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition. These goals are not ours alone. They've been endorsed by the United Nations Security Council 5 times in as many weeks. Most countries share our concern for principle, and many have a stake in the stability of the Persian Gulf. This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world. May I say that I just had a very useful meeting with His Highness the Amir, and I reiterated the total commitment of the United States to the objectives that are enshrined in 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions. We agreed on the desirability that these objectives be realized peacefully. At the same time, we also agreed that all options remained open and that steps needed to be taken right now.
Soldiers of the 18th Airborne Corps, our Commander-in-Chief.
Over the past 4 months, you have launched what history will judge as one of the most important deployments of Allied military power since 1945. And I've come here today to personally thank you. The world is watching. I've spoken with the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, who reported to me on his nearly 7 hours of conversation with the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz. Secretary Baker made it clear that he discerned no evidence whatsoever that Iraq was willing to comply with the international community's demand to withdraw from Kuwait and comply with the United Nations resolutions. Let me emphasize that I have not given up on a peaceful outcome. It's not too late. The choice of peace or war is really Saddam Hussein's to make. Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. Israel is not a participant. Israel is not a combatant. And this man is elected to launch a terroristic attack. When the Soviet Union made such a strong statement, that was very reassuring. And we are in close touch with our coalition partners. And this coalition is not going to fall apart. Now, with remarkable technological advances like the Patriot missile, we can defend against ballistic missile attacks aimed at innocent civilians. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal. We went halfway around the world to do what is moral and just and right. We fought hard, and with others, we won the war. We lifted the yoke of aggression and tyranny from a small country that many Americans had never even heard of, and we asked nothing in return. We're coming home now, proud, confident, heads high. There is much that we must do, at home and abroad, and we will do it. We are Americans. May God bless this great nation, the United States of America. Thank you all very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Howdy, and thank you all for coming to what I know will be a historic occasion right here at Texas A&M. Let me start by thanking Ryan Crocker, our superb dean at the Bush School, for inviting me to say a few words tonight. I can't tell you how proud we are to have Ryan Crocker leading our school. He's so respected. His career of service in our foreign service has few, if any, peers, and it remains a great source of pride and comfort knowing he's captaining our ship at the Bush School and showing our students by example what the words public service is all about. Before I do say a few words, however, let me add my Navy days taught me the importance of a good wingman. And I'm happy to say I had a very good wingman as flying wing in the presidency. He was strong and able and a leader whose counsel I valued. Would you please give a warm Aggie welcome to my good friend and the man who served so ably as Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle. There's the man. Great. Oh, nice. Good to see you. I also, please be seated. I also want to extend a warm welcome to the veterans of Desert Storm who accepted the invitation to attend this special commemoration. And this time I'd like to ask each of them to stand and be recognized for their selfless service to our nation. I don't see you, but welcome. In a moment, we will receive a good reminder why no president was ever better served by his foreign policy team than the 41st President of the United States. There are not enough superlatives for me to describe my gratitude and pride in each of the members of what we call the Gang of Eight. And after Harry Truman became president, Texas' own Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, went to the White House to see the new Commander-in-Chief. And as they were sitting in the Oval Office, Speaker Rayburn offered some free advice. And he said, Mr. President, you're going to have a staff around telling you day in and day out that you're the smartest man in the world. And that's going to have a real effect on you. But the truth is, Mr. President, we both know it's a damn lie. And the truth is, none of the men from whom you're about to hear ever suggested I was the smartest man in the world. But that wasn't their job. Their job was to give me their best advice so that we, working together, could keep America safe while also advancing the values of human freedom and free markets around a world awakening from the Cold War. And so the gratitude in my heart to Dan Quayle, our panelists Jim Baker, General Walt Boomer, Dick Cheney, General Colin Powell, and General Brent Scowcroft knows no bounds. I might add a word of regret that another key member of our team, General Norm Schwarzkopf, was not able to be with us tonight, but he sent a wonderful message that you're going to hear later on. My dear sweet mother, now in heaven, taught us as kids never to braggadocio. And as president, let me candidly confide, there were a few things I probably could have done better. But in the case of Desert Storm, I honestly believe history will say we got this one right. And we stood firm, first and foremost, to protect America's security and interests as our solemn responsibilities demanded. But the team from which you're about to hear also worked very hard. and we took more than a few risks to build support on Capitol Hill and in the international community, so our troops had the full support on the battlefield they richly deserved. Every international crisis is different, of course, but the events of 20 years ago presented us with one of those rare moments afforded by history when mankind came together and joined in a noble cause, and in so doing, realized our higher aspirations. It was one of the great honors of my life to lead our team and troops and to help shape the momentous events that led to such hopeful outcome, the liberation of Kuwait. We regret that the Amir of Kuwait, who was scheduled to come, was detained in Kuwait on official business, but we're pleased to welcome the Amir's envoy, Sheikh Ahmed Jabbar Al-Sabah, who has led a distinguished delegation from Kuwait. Will you please join me in welcoming him? Where is he now? Now I'm supposed to move over here.
Mr. President, distinguished guests, old friends, faculty members and students, thank you for your warm and generous welcome. I am truly honored and humbled to be here today with such noble individuals, all true friends of Kuwait. I can honestly say that one of the most important factors in being here today as the envoy of His Highness the Amir of the State of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Jabr Al-Sabah, is to remind you of the courage and vision of President George Herbert Walker Bush 20 years ago, when he decreed that the outrageous aggression against my country would not stand. This clearly is one of history's most notable achievements, and it will be forever remembered. His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Jabr Al-Sabah, would say the same thing if he could be here with us today. Unfortunately, he is unable to attend because he is in Sharm el-Sheikh attending the Arab Economic Summit, an idea which he initiated himself. He is handing over his responsibilities as chairman of that summit to the Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. I assure you, His Highness is with us today in heart and spirit. I would like to recall the memory of the liberation of Kuwait, which began 20 years ago with the commencement of Operation Desert Storm. It marked the pinnacle of the historical relationship between our two countries, a relationship which has endured for over 60 years and was ultimately tested when Saddam Hussein's forces invaded and occupied Kuwait. Under the leadership of President Bush, the United States of America sought legitimacy for the international coalition by working through the United Nations. The United States did not take the easy path of acting alone without international legal sanction. Guided by the Charter of the United Nations, American diplomacy, inspired not only by President Bush, but also by Secretary of State James Baker, led to the implementation of dozens of UN Security Council resolutions, many under Chapter 7. The US did not rush to use force. Its strategy provided room and time for diplomacy to work. Still, there was no hesitance to act boldly after the Iraqi regime rejected all international diplomatic attempts to complete the withdraw its forces from Kuwait. History also records the tireless efforts to assemble a historic multinational coalition under UN auspices. The coalition was the broadest and strongest ever put together to enforce UN resolutions. It truly spanned the world's nations and included the full support of countries and organizations in the Middle East region, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The coalition undertook a major military campaign, Operation Desert Storm, against Iraq, which ultimately liberated Kuwait. Kuwait's Air Force proudly participated in that coalition, flying its fighters from bases in Saudi Arabia. Allow me, Mr. President, to express the gratitude of the people and the government of Kuwait to the leading and significant role which the peoples and the governments of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Egypt, Syria, and other coalition countries played not only in the liberation of my country, but also in hosting the Kuwaitis who were forced to leave Kuwait during the occupation. In the weeks and months following the launch of Desert Storm, President Bush adhered to the spirit and letter of the many UN resolutions and the mandates they contained. In line with these resolutions, he halted all military actions after Kuwait was liberated and its legitimate government restored. There were no acts of vengeful retribution. The result of President Bush's decisive action not only liberated Kuwait, but laid the basis for the renewal of the Middle East peace process with the convening of the Madrid Conference. The world is a safer place thanks to Desert Storm and to the strength of the international community's response to Saddam Hussein's aggression. There are no words to express the enormous gratitude of the Kuwaiti people for America's role in leading the international coalition that literally saved our country. Kuwait is deeply grateful to the young men and women of the coalition forces from many nations around the world for their selfless role they played when they were called upon to help save the people of a small, faraway nation from the brutal aggression of a ruthless neighbor. Their sacrifice and valor continue today in the distant lands as they fight in the war against threat of terrorism. Even as we remember and mourn the loss of parents, husbands, wives, sisters, and brothers, it cannot be said often enough. Their bravery was not in vain. We cannot even imagine the result if Saddam had not been expelled from Kuwait. Where would he have stopped? What would the region look like? How many of the other Gulf nations would have held on to their independence and freedom? Kuwait liberation was not just a restoration of the old order. It led to a new dynamic in our economic, political, social, and environmental development. Anyone who has visited the Gulf states recently and has seen the phenomenal changes that have taken place and talked to the people cannot help but be astonished by the change. Our liberation also gave us a new awareness and appreciation for our links to the rest of the region and the world beyond. The participation of so many countries in restoring our freedom made us realize the importance of being part of the international community. Once again, I thank the privilege of being with you today to commemorate the start of Operation Desert Storm for the liberation of Kuwait, and to especially remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice for that purpose. Next month, as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of Kuwait's liberation, we once again will pay tribute to those who have fell in battle and express our eternal gratitude to all those who shared in our liberation. Believe me, and its people, Kuwait and its people will never forget you. We carry in our hearts what you did for us each and every day. Thank you. God bless the United States of America. God bless Kuwait. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikh Ahmed, for those very generous remarks, a great tribute to a lasting friendship and alliance. I will now introduce the national security leadership of that era, and we're very pleased that that spirit of partnership is symbolized in this panel by the presence first of His Excellency Mohammad Abdullah Abul Hassan, currently Senior Advisor to His Highness the Amir of Kuwait, at the time of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Kuwait's representative to the United Nations. The Honorable Richard B. Cheney, 46th Vice President of the United States, and then Secretary of Defense. The Honorable Colin L. Powell, 65th Secretary of State of the United States, and in 1990-1991, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Honorable Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor to President Gerald Ford, and then to President George H.W. Bush. General Walter E. Boomer, United States Marine Corps, Commander of the United States Marines in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. the Honorable James A. Baker III, the 61st Secretary of State of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. This is an event in history, and the men who sit behind me joined President Bush in making it. But before I turn to them, I would like to recognize some of you in front of me. And I'll start by pointing out that events like this don't just happen. They require considerable support, and the Bush School is deeply grateful to Shell Oil Company, the Board of Directors of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation, and Texas A&M University for making all of this possible. This campus has sent Aggies to fields of battle in every American war since 1876. And this evening, we all join President Bush in a special thank you for the veterans of Desert Shield and Desert Storm who stepped forward 20 years ago and changed our world. We remember and honor your service and sacrifice, and we especially remember your comrades who are forever absent, but always present in our memories, those who gave their lives for the liberation of Kuwait. I'd also like to recognize other men and women of our military, led by Lieutenant General Guy Swan, 5th Army Commander, and my former Baghdad comrade, and by 3rd Corps and Fort Hood Commander, Major General William Grimsley. Thank you on behalf of all of us for fighting America's current battles. I also thank our own Fightin' Texas Aggie Band and the Corps of Cadets, led by Brigadier General Joe Ramirez, for their participation, many of whom will go on to careers in the military. Not all of us who serve do so in uniform. I was a bit player at the time as director of the Iraq-Kuwait Task Force at the State Department, and remember that every now and then, Secretary Baker would stick his head in and be absolutely certain we were doing our job with at least reasonable competence, and we pretended that we were. I'm pleased to recognize tonight Ambassador Nat Howell, with whom I spoke almost every day during those long months, and who, with his courageous Foreign Service colleagues at the embassy in Kuwait, gave shelter to Americans fleeing Saddam and kept our flag flying in occupied Kuwait. I also welcome my friend and colleague, Ambassador Skip Ghanim, who resumed our diplomatic presence in Kuwait literally within hours of liberation and began the process of rebuilding a shattered nation. Finally, A&M is known for welcoming students from around the world, including tonight those from Iraq and Kuwait. I hope the education they receive here will help them build a future in the region that is far different than the past that we will discuss tonight. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was, in many respects, the event that marked the end of the Cold War and the bipolar world, and the beginning of a new, dangerous, and uncharted era in which we still live. Immediately after the invasion, President Bush declared the American position in 4 clear words: "This will not stand." His national security team on this stage tonight devised and executed the strategies that made good on that pledge. In this first momentous post-Cold War challenge to the world, as the President put it, they got it right. Now we will hear their story of how they did it, the combination of diplomacy and force, the crafting of an international coalition, the complex managing of multiple relationships and messages to Americans, to the international community, and to Saddam. They are truly the dream team, the model of effective national security policy making and interagency execution, whose actions and organization has been and will be studied by generations of scholars. As the President noted, unfortunately, one member of the team is absent because of health, General Norman Schwarzkopf. He did write on this occasion, and I would be very grateful if General Powell would take a moment to read his letter.
We miss Norm very much, but I can assure you he is here with us in spirit, and he asked that we read this letter from him. It is with deep regret that I am unable to be with you today to deliver this message personally. Though many years have passed, the events of 1991 remain some of the most defining and proudest of this old soldier's life. Anniversaries allow us an opportunity to reflect on events that have greatly impacted our lives. The thoughts and feelings I have about my time in the Middle East and the 541,000 courageous men and women I had the privilege of commanding have etched an indelible place in my soul and are thought of more often than just on the anniversaries that mark the passing of time. To celebrate the victories of Operation Desert Storm is to celebrate the union of 34 allied nations, joined by the recognition that unprovoked aggression against a peaceful nation would not be tolerated. Our mission was victorious because we had the best trained military in the world, a president who, as commander-in-chief, possessed the fortitude to make tough calls when they needed to be made, and the unwavering support of the American people. Let us also remember that while we celebrate the victories of the past, sons and daughters of the United States of America continue to serve across the globe to keep this great nation safe from those who would do us harm. Freedom is not, nor has it ever been, cost-free. It is paid for with the blood and lives of our service members. My thoughts today are with the families of those who made the ultimate sacrifice for the cause of freedom. May we remember them always. And finally, to the 541,000 magnificent men and women who were the thunder and lightning of Operation Desert Storm, know that a child will be born in Kuwait today, and that child will be born into freedom. Free because of your service and your sacrifice. There is no greater contribution one can make, nor greater legacy one can leave behind. Our mission in Kuwait ended 20 years ago, but the impact will endure for generations to come. May God bless and protect our veterans, members of the armed forces, and the United States of America. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf.
Now the speeches are over and the discussion begins. I'm going to pose a few questions to members of the panel individually and collectively, and I hope that will start a conversation among the panel. Given the caliber of the people on this stage, of course, they are perfectly capable and even likely to ignore whatever I may ask and say whatever they want. That will all be part of the evening's fun. Both President Bush and I and so many others in so many countries for so many years have talked about you as the model of how national security is managed, orchestrated, and executed. So I'd start with that first procedural question. How did you become what you were? The team that so artfully and effectively put together the coalition, managed the diplomacy, and for General Powell and General Boomer, managed the war. How did the civilian and the military aspects of a coherent plan come together? And also, in addition to just devising it, how did you ensure its effective execution? As we have learned, both before and since, there can be a great gulf between the two. So it's a general question, open to whoever would like to start the ball rolling.
I'll go. Jim, you want to start?
Yeah.
I think we had a splendid marriage of the political and military strategy and the political and military objectives. We were blessed by having a president who is decisive as a political leader and decisive as a commander-in-chief. A diplomatic team led by Jim Baker that did a splendid job in pulling the coalition together and in getting the necessary international support for what we were doing. The fellow who was in charge of making sure we all moved at the same time in the same direction was Brent Scowcroft. And Dick Cheney, as Secretary of Defense, gave masterful leadership to the armed forces of the United States as our commander in the Pentagon. On the military side, we had some gifted commanders, beginning with Norm Schwarzkopf and all of his component commanders, who can include General Walt Boomer. We also had a new authority under the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which made the lines of authority within the military and our linkage with the civilian leadership very, very clear. And the thing I think that really made us, in my judgment, a very effective team is that we weren't strangers to this. All of us had been in government for long periods of time. We all had different assignments within government, and we all knew each other. We had respect for each other. We had knowledge of each other's idiosyncrasies, strengths, and weaknesses, and we were able to talk as sort of a band of brothers, never taking anything personally in the heat of any disagreement. And so because of the experience we had, and because of the authorities that the military now had, and because of the leadership provided by President Bush, I think we had a pretty good team.
I would second that, Ryan. And I think principally that derives from the fact that we had a leader in President Bush whose vast prior governmental experience had taught him how the national security apparatus ought to work. And he formulated and implemented a national security team and apparatus that did work that way. And I've often said that I think, frankly, we were the exception to the rule, because today, in so many administrations, doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democratic, you see internecine warfare between members of the national security team of an administration, and we didn't have that. As Colin said, we'd all been friends and we'd worked together in prior iterations, in prior administrations. But I think first and foremost, it was the fact that our leader knew how the team ought to work, and he saw to it that it worked that way. And we were very fortunate in that respect. And we did not have the backbiting and the backstabbing and leaking and fighting that other administrations have seen, sadly.
I'd like to underscore that. I agree with every word that's been said, and I think it was so important here because the job of coordinating our efforts was so complicated. First, we had the Russians, who joined us solidly, but wanted to keep a protective arm around their close friend, Iraq, and protect it if possible. Then we had the coalition we built, 34 countries in the end, each one of them with different sort of requirements and demands, including those who couldn't send troops and money, coordinated that with NATO, how much of this was to be a NATO or a non-NATO or a semi-NATO effort. The UN, we wanted to get the world community behind this effort and that took an awful lot of diplomatic time. And last but not least, the Congress, who started out supportive on a defensive effort. As the buildup continued and it looked like we would have an offensive capability, the problem started. Does the president have authority to do this? Where is the Congress role? And so on. And we finally scraped through in the end with a favorable congressional resolution. But all of these took separate kinds and conflicting kinds of coordination. So it was a very difficult job that we had to consult very closely together on a daily basis.
Everyone up here on the dais, of course, knows this, but I'm not sure everyone in the audience appreciates the fact that this is the only time in history that the United Nations Security Council has voted to use force against a member state. The Security Council was exercising its Chapter 7 responsibilities under the Charter, first and only time it ever did it, except in the Korean War when the Soviets walked out and they were able to get a resolution authorizing the use of force. So it was quite a significant event from that standpoint, and it made the job of reversing Iraq's aggression considerably easier. It also made the job of getting approval of a Democratic House and Senate considerably easier, because we could go to a senator. We barely won the vote in the Senate, 52 to 47, but we could go to a senator who was withholding his support and say, you mean you're not going to support the president, Senator so-and-so, when the president of Ethiopia is supporting him, or the president of this other country or that other country, and it made it possible for us to bring him across. Dick worked very hard on that as well.
Mohammad.
Thank you. We really were watching, the national team working together in a very formidable way, but also we were anticipating that the need for going outside, the boundaries of the national security to the international community. Government of Kuwait, though it was an exile in Taif, we embarked immediately, maybe the first week after the invasion, to reach out to the former Soviet Union. We took the Saudis with us because we know that if we want to achieve a breakthrough, in a very quick and vast breakthrough in creating the coalition, we're supposed to go first to the Soviet Union to convince them to stand strong, because we knew the relation between Iraq and Soviet Union was enormous. The interest, the economic interest, the oil interest was great. We went direct to them, and immediately His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah went to China. We focused on these two permanent members in order to make sure that they will be standing with the three other permanent members. I was in the United Nations. I knew that the problem was, first of all, not with the whole membership of Security Council. Mainly it was with the permanent members. Three of them were already beside Kuwait. But we had to work, and we worked closely, and thanks God that we were able to get both of them on board.
I'm going to come back in a minute to the international diplomacy of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, because you both raised some interesting points, but I want to drill down a little bit about what we were just talking about. Again, the model national security team. You certainly are all that. I guess what I'm trying to do is find out if you're all eligible for sainthood.
If we're what?
Eligible for sainthood. Were there ever serious disputes among you that you can recall? Some real knockdown dragouts. That's one. And two, if there were, and I can see there were there ever any that you could not ultimately work out yourself and that you had to take to the president for resolution?
Well, there's certain procedures we put in place. My colleagues have described sort of the foundation, the relationships that existed even before we went to work in the Bush administration. But we set up, for example, Wednesday morning breakfast that Brent and Jim and I would have together, just the three of us in Brent's office. Food wasn't bad, but the
Wasn't good.
wasn't good, but it wasn't bad. But the notion was that we kept state and defense and the White House all working off the same agenda. And the staffs, I know the Defense Department, quickly got to the point where people down in the bureaucracy figured out that if they had a major issue that needed to be resolved, that they could get it into the agenda, the Wednesday morning breakfast. That was the best way to get it resolved. And the three of us really had very, very few disagreements that we couldn't solve among ourselves. There were a few, I suppose, that had to go to the president. I remember a big argument over this question of whether or not we needed to go to the Congress to get authorization to use force. We were in a position where we deployed a couple 100,000 troops by then. We had authority, I felt, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, where Kuwait, a UN member, had been attacked. We'd ratified the charter years before. We had all the authorization we needed to use force to go to our friends and liberate Kuwait. But I lost the argument. And the decision was made, primarily because the president overruled me and I think some of the others, that it was very important for us to go get congressional authorization. My argument was that, look, if we ask for approval and they don't give it to us, then what are we going to do? Are you going to pack up 200,000 troops and bring them home? Are you going to go forward without that kind of approval? The president obviously was the decider and got to make the decision, but we had a very thoroughgoing debate, but entirely friendly. There were never any leaks. Nobody went out and put out their own point of view on it. We got it resolved, and we did what the president wanted to do, which was always the case.
As I said at the earlier event, Ryan, we concluded it would be very advisable if we could get UN Security Council authorization. But we also waited until the United States was in the chair, president of the council. It was held at the foreign minister level, and so I was conducting the meeting, and we would never have brought the issue up. Dick's absolutely right on that point. We don't want to bring it up and lose it. But we would never have brought it up had we not known that we had the votes to pass it. And as the ambassador pointed out a minute ago, our big worries all along were the Soviet Union and China. When we got the Soviet Union early on to join with us in a condemnation of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, we sort of felt, well, maybe we'll be able to bring them along, maybe not to vote affirmatively in favor, but maybe to abstain. They ended up voting in favor of the resolution of force, but China was very difficult, and it was only at the last minute that we got China to agree to abstain. But we would never have gone for a vote unless we knew we had the votes to pass.
On this specific point, if I may, excuse me, no good team can be a good team unless it has disagreements. The question is, do you have a way of resolving those disagreements? We're all being very kind up here, but we had lots of fights. We had disagreements over military strategy. We had disagreements over rate of flow of troops. There were some occasions, and Dick Cheney's too kind to mention some of these disagreements, but there were occasional moments when he thought I was off the farm. Isn't that true?
Yes. I can think of other ways to express it, but
But I generally knew when I'd stepped over the line, and he would quickly remind me that I had stepped over the line, and we would resolve it. And so it is not, should you have disagreements or not, you have to have disagreements, or else you don't get the best ideas out. You don't get the real arguments on the table in front of the president. And the president was masterful about letting us argue with each other in front of him. And he would sort of stand back, cross his legs, chew his lip a little bit, and just let us go at it. And then when he'd had enough and had the best benefit of all of our agreements and disagreements, we could expect him to make a decision in a decisive manner. But that's what makes a functioning team work well.
My government it seems to be a week after the liberation, after the invasion, decided to provoke Article 51 of Charter of the United Nations. We knew that already President Bush had made the decision that this aggression will not stand, but also we wanted to have the other option, the option of having not only the major player in the field, the United States, UK, France, but we seeked the help of 71 countries around the world. I informed the Secretary General that Kuwait is provoking Article 51. Letter from His Highness the Amir, the late Amir Sheikh Jabir, has been sent to most of them, and the rest I have handed it to their permanent representative in New York. But nevertheless, though this option was on the table, Kuwait preferred that it should go through Security Council, through the national legitimacy of Security Council. Particularly, we were encouraged that the first meeting of Security Council, though it was called only 2 hours before its convenience, it convened on 2 o'clock early morning of the 2nd. The whole of Security Council was full of members of the General Assembly. I counted, my friends, there were more than 110 permanent representatives. And it may be, if you go back to the history of drafting resolutions, it was the first resolution which could have been drafted within 15 minutes. Had it not been for the absence of permanent representative of Yemen, he did not want to have his seat. He was playing with the rules of procedure of the Security Council, saying that if any member of the council will not attend, then the meeting will not be called. We tried really to push him. This took us around 1 hour. He was excusing himself that his government has not yet given him instruction, but really, literally, we pushed him to the council. And the resolution 660, which condemned the aggression, which considered it flagrant violation to international peace and security, which called upon Iraq to immediately withdraw its forces to the 1st of August boundaries. It has been issued within 2 hours and 10 minutes. From this attendance, the speediness of taking this very important resolution, and under Chapter 7, as Mr. James Baker said, that it was the second or the third, to be frank. The first one was Korea, the second one was South Africa, and the third resolution under Chapter 7 was Kuwait. We were really very optimistic that we should continue on the course of Security Council. It is the legitimacy of the United Nations, and already we have the support of 71 members of the United Nations accepting to join the coalition by that time.
One of the reasons that we wanted to use the United Nations, not only as an assist in our own domestic concerns, but because the president had in mind, this was a period where the Cold War was ending, and he wanted to establish new kind of rules of the world, a new world order, if you will. And he saw that as being able to use the United Nations Security Council, which was set up in 1945 to deal with disputes, and to use that vehicle as a means to coordinate world opinion, as His Excellency said. And so we had multiple goals through all this, all coordinated by the president toward this general end.
I think that's a key point.
We shouldn't forget that the president had been America's ambassador to the United Nations. Right. So when we were debating whether or not to go to the United Nations, those of us who wanted to give it a shot had a little bit of an advantage.
He had already been there, yes.
He'd been there. He knew what it was all about.
And Mr. Baker, don't forget that Security Council, in particular for Arab world, it was not very popular. the feeling of Arab world for Security Council has been affected by how they have dealt with Palestinian issue and the Middle East issue since '67. Therefore, when they saw Kuwait is depending on Security Council, I was receiving several messages that you are going the wrong way. I mean, just let the coalition to take care of the Iraqis. But no, I mean, we said that we really, because of the nature of the aggression itself. I mean, Kuwait was different than any other country. It's a small country, but it was far-reaching to all the international community.
Both Secretary Baker and Ambassador Abu al-Hassan have touched on the importance of the Soviet Union at this period. Kuwait had extensive interactions. We certainly did, first with Gorbachev, of course, with Shevardnadze, later with his successor. And of course, as we saw in yesterday's New York Times, there were some fairly extensive and fairly heated discussions going on between Baghdad and Moscow, particularly during the latter phase of this period as we moved toward conflict and the pace of Russian interaction, if anything, intensified with Besmirtnik and you. Did you all stay pretty much of a common mind about where the Russians were and how we should deal with them? And I'm talking again, particularly that last January-February period.
I think very much so. They were Soviets, of course, at the time. And they weighed in at every time a deadline was approaching, they would weigh in with us to not take action, don't do this, delay. But there was never any suggestion, I can't remember any suggestion on the part of any of the national security team that we ought to accede to those requests. The President, though, was very anxious that we not do so in a way that didn't alienate the leadership of the Soviet Union, particularly Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, with whom we were working to achieve at the very same time a peaceful end to the Cold War. The Cold War didn't have to end peacefully. It could have ended with a bang instead of a whimper. So when we would turn them down, we would always have to find some reason or excuse to do so, but we were able to do that. I said this morning that I thought it was very fortuitous that I happened to be negotiating an arms control issue with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union at the very time that Iraq invaded Kuwait. I told the story, and I will tell it here for the bigger audience, that I got word from the State Department that Iraqi troops were massing on the border of Kuwait. And I said to Edward Shevardnadze, I said, this is very troubling to us. We think that Iraq may be preparing to take action. And he said, oh, I can't conceive of that happening. He said, I don't think they would be so foolish as to do that. We broke for lunch. I said, you might want to check with the KGB and find out whether there's any substance to it. Our intelligence agencies say it's very real. He came back from lunch and he said, I've checked with the KGB. There's no substance at all to that. Saddam would not be so foolish. Well, he looked very bad 24 hours later when Iraq marched into Kuwait. And I think that's one of the reasons, frankly, that he was willing to stand here, the Soviet foreign minister now, standing shoulder to shoulder with the American Secretary of State 2 days later, condemning this action by a Soviet client state. That was unheard of. We were still in the Cold War period. And so I think it was very fortuitous the way it happened. I also think it was fortuitous that it happened at the same time that the president was having a meeting with Prime Minister Thatcher. And there was a lot of, I think Saddam was a master of miscalculation, and he miscalculated badly when he picked the time to invade Kuwait.
We spent a lot of time on the diplomacy of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, because it is important. And we talked about the importance of the vote that produced Resolution 678, all necessary means. There were two important votes at that time, and the other, of course, took place in our Congress in January. And as you pointed out, that was pretty close in the Senate. 52 to 47. If that vote had gone the wrong way, what would you have recommended to the President?
I would have recommended that we go forward anyway. Let's say I was a believer in the notion that we already had, from a legal standpoint, all the authority we needed. Of course, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't let that stand in the way, though, of a firm opinion. And but I really firmly believe that you couldn't go through the motions of deploying a large American force poised to liberate Kuwait and then pack it up and take it home and not do anything with it, not use it. The president, I think, as I look back on it now, made exactly the right decision when he said we've got to go to the Congress and get a vote, and in fact put the Congress on record. I think that turned out to be a very sound strategy. But I would have argued, even if we'd lost the vote, that we really had no choice but to go forward.
Well, I am a lawyer, and I would have argued the same thing. And I'm quite confident that the president would have gone anyway, because we did have the authority under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
It's one of the things I think the president spent a lot of time thinking about, how he would act. Fortunately, we were not faced with that, but I think we would have been, my sense is we would have been unanimous in saying, this is in the national interest, we need to do it.
My recollection is that he already had made that decision in his own mind before we went to the Congress. We knew that's what we do.
You don't think that the vote in the Security Council on the 29th of November to allow all the necessary measures has little bit effect on the Congress?
It had a big effect. It had a big effect.
Because here they have felt that it has a national legitimacy.
That had a huge effect on our ability to get the House and the Senate to approve it. And as we've said before, the Senate vote was very narrow. Yes. But the question was whether we would go forward, the president would have gone forward even if the Senate or House had not approved it. And in my opinion, he would have.
I'd like to turn just for a moment to the military planning, particularly in the early phases. General Powell, as you noted, you were the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after Goldwater-Nichols that fundamentally restructured relationships in and among the military. I think gave the chairman significantly enhanced authorities. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the difference that Goldwater-Nichols made to your ability to do your job the way you did it, and how it would have been different if you hadn't had Goldwater-Nichols. And then secondly, whatever you might like to say about, again, early military planning, and whether you would care to perhaps explain to the audience what the phrase, hey diddle diddle right up the middle, might mean in the concept of military planning. So.
I don't think that's in any manual, but I'll try to cover it. The Goldwater-Nichols law made the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff the principal military advisor to the President of the United States, to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, and to the Vice President of the United States. It didn't mean the other chiefs were not advisors. They were also advisors, but the chairman was the principal military advisor, meaning that the chairman could present his own position, whether it reflected the position of the chiefs or not. During this entire period, every position I presented also represented the position of the chiefs, so we were a unified body, and it worked very well. I didn't get any really new authority. Most of the authority that I seemed to exercise was because Mr. Cheney let me exercise influence and authority. It's really the relationship between the secretary and the chairman that's more important than what the Goldwater-Nichols law said. The other thing it did was give me a powerful staff that would help me. And it gave the theater commander, in this case General Schwarzkopf, more ability to get the job done. Everybody was answerable to him. Everybody in that theater worked for General Schwarzkopf and nobody else. And it made it clear that General Schwarzkopf worked directly for the Secretary of Defense. As a practical matter, from day to day, he reported through me to the Secretary of Defense, but he worked with the Secretary of Defense and through the Secretary to the President. The initial planning after we realized the challenge that was before us A lot of it had been done because General Schwarzkopf and his staff and commanders had begun to change the standing plans that were there and envisioned an entirely different scenario. So when the invasion happened, within just a few days, General Schwarzkopf was able to present to us and to the President of the United States a way of dealing with this. And the way of dealing with it was, first, go to the United Nations, impose sanctions. Second, put in place a maritime interdiction force that would stop the commerce going up and down, back and forth to Iraq. Third, we have to deter the Iraqis to make sure there's no illusion in their part that they could come south out of Kuwait into the Gulf area and into Saudi Arabia. So deterrence was the first military task. Get troops on the ground right away. 82nd Airborne, some Marines start moving in, the Air Force moves in, and then build that up so you can do the next task, which was to defend Saudi Arabia. Not just deter, but if anyone did attack, we could defend Saudi Arabia. We achieved that mission with a buildup of close to 250,000 troops by early November. It was at that point we went to the President and said, we're now built up. We don't know whether this problem will be solved by sanctions or not, but if you want to have a capability to take offensive action to kick them out of Kuwait, then we need to build up some more. We need another 250,000 troops. And in a very momentous meeting in the Situation Room with all of us present, we presented this to President Bush, and he thought about it for a few moments. We discussed it among ourselves and argued a little bit, and he said, do it, and that's what we did. So by the time Desert Storm began in January, we had a force of some 500,000 people. And the mission of that force was to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. It was also a mission that was the mission, and we weren't going to Baghdad. All of the controversy about going to Baghdad, should we have gone to Baghdad or not, it was never an issue or area under consideration. It was nothing the military was planning for. We would not have been able to put this coalition together if that coalition thought that we were going to Baghdad. We had a Syrian division in General Schwarzkopf's force. We had an Egyptian division. We had lots of other forces who were there because the mission was specific. And so it executed almost the way Norm painted it on the first week. Now, lots happened. We had to move 541,000 folks. We had to feed them. We had to give them water. We had to give them shelter. We had to get all the troops there. But pretty much it executed as we had laid it out. And I think General Boomer might want to talk to it because he was one of those executors.
I would digress for a moment. I seriously doubt that anyone on this stage is a candidate for sainthood. But I would say this, as a senior military commander, looking up to this group, the group gave us tremendous confidence. Those things that you have heard them talk about, the way they were able to speak together with one voice, the way the president handled this issue, caused us to feel like there's nothing that we need that we won't receive. And everything that we needed, we did, in fact, receive. Even to the president visiting us with the First Lady in the middle of the desert. Quite a remarkable Thanksgiving day. And one quick story about the First Lady. She was so gracious signing the backs of the shirts of all of these, in this case, young Marines. When she and the president left and they were moving down a road to go to the helicopter, all of these youngsters lined the road and were saying, "Goodbye, Mrs. Bush, thank you for coming." And there were tears running down her eyes, and I was sitting next to her. And I said, "Mrs. Bush, if you don't stop this, I'm going to cry, and that would not be a good thing for the commanding general to be seen crying." I mention that to you, though, because we received that kind of leadership from the entire team.
Would you say that, I guess it was the end of October, General Powell, you mentioned it, the core group, 28th or so, put the proposition forward that if we wanted to go offensive, we'd need to double the force.
Yeah, it wasn't a surprise. The president knew. We had told him months earlier that about that time we would come to him for additional instructions, and that's what happened in early November.
Would you say that was the decision to go to war?
That was the decision that said, if this doesn't get resolved in a peaceful manner, we're going to go to war and resolve it.
And let me ask you again, thinking back to that meeting, that date, end of October, what each of you felt, how this was going to play out, whether you felt we were going to war or whether you felt sanctions still might turn this trick?
No, I thought by then, by early November, middle of November, when Saddam Hussein did not respond in any way to suddenly another 250,000 Americans on their way, when he took no note of it, he didn't readjust his troops, he didn't start seeking to get out of the box he was in, then I was quite confident that we were going to go to war. He wasn't going to blink. And he was going to sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands of his soldiers for this. So I was quite sure that that's where we probably were going to be.
Talking about that second influx of troops, you know, we received some criticism after it was all over that went like this: well, you really didn't need all of those folks there. I will tell you, I had the 1st Marine Division there on the ground. When the second one rolled in, I was one happy camper. One happy camper. We were facing the 4th largest army in the world. And it wasn't until we had been there for a while on the ground that we finally came to realize that perhaps they weren't all they were cracked up to be, and they turned out not to be that great. But we didn't know that. I think what became known as the Powell Doctrine is absolutely the right way to go to war, with sufficient forces.
Ryan, if I may.
Ryan.
Add just an element. One of the things that always struck me about the way the president responded, you know, to these things we bring to him to debate or discuss or decide, he was able to focus on what we were doing and why we were doing it, and not get caught up in the political world. In other words, he never made a decision that I found while I was there, when I went and asked him for troops, or asked to call up reserves, or say we've got to send more divisions. He never once made a decision within a political context. It was always what makes sense, what do you need to do the job, and then we went forward and did the job. He always, it was very different from the way I had heard it had been in prior administrations, where presidents would sit in the West Wing and their staffs and make decisions based on political considerations as opposed to what's best from the standpoint of the troops and how do we accomplish the mission.
For the panel member who just joined us, if you don't want to study war no more, you better be ready to fight a war.
Secretary Baker, General Scowcroft, if you look back in your recollections, at what point did it seem pretty clear to the two of you that sanctions weren't going to get it done and that we were heading for combat?
Well, I think as far as I'm concerned, it was when we augmented the force there in November. It was clear to me then that if sanctions didn't work, we were going to go, but it was You know, when the president got off the helicopter Sunday, coming back from Camp David, and said this aggression will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait, that told us all that while we might try political and diplomatic and economic sanctions, if they didn't work, we were going to have to do it by force. And then when we got the resolution authorizing the use of force from the Security Council, it was quite obvious that's what we were going to do. The president was very judicious and careful about making sure that history would record that he left no stone unturned in the effort to avoid having to do it forcefully and through military means and having to go to war. And he proposed at some point, I can't remember exactly when that was, that I go to Baghdad and meet with Saddam, and that Saddam's foreign minister come to Washington and meet with him. Of course, Saddam was too busy to find any time that we could schedule such a visit. He had time to see other Americans who would go over there who were sympathetic to him, but he didn't have time to see the Secretary of State of the United States. And then ultimately that devolved into a meeting of the foreign ministers as sort of a last chance effort to avoid war. That took place on January 7th, 8 days before our deadline to begin the conflict. I was visiting with the ambassador earlier today, and the fact that we even had that meeting made a lot of people nervous, that somehow maybe we were going to back off.
We were nervous.
And he was one of them. And he was one. But let me tell you something. There was never the slightest chance that we would ever negotiate down from a UN Security Council resolution that we'd achieved, which said, get out of Kuwait and get out unconditionally. So we weren't ever gonna negotiate. One of the benefits, there was one benefit that came from that meeting. It was a 7-hour meeting. And one benefit was that before I went to Geneva, Colin said to me, he said, I wish you would convey a message to the foreign minister when you're there. Tell him that if he uses weapons of mass destruction on our forces, that the American people will demand revenge or vengeance. And I used those exact words. In fact, what I said was, let me tell you, Mr. Minister, if you use weapons of mass destruction against our troops, the American people will demand revenge, and we have the means to exact it. And then I said, Mr. Minister, that is not a threat. It is a promise. So then, then, interestingly enough, after Saddam was captured in 2003, or 4, whenever it was, 3, I guess, and interrogated, they said, why didn't you use your chemical weapons against the American forces in Desert Storm? He said, I didn't use them because of what Baker told Aziz in Geneva. Interesting. And now today, I might say this, I volunteered this earlier today when we were talking to Brian Williams. We now have a policy that says we won't do that anymore. We've changed our national intelligence posture.
Declaratory policy.
Declaratory policy. And so we won't threaten people with the use of our weapons of mass destruction that are members of the NPT. And that's a mistake in my view, because I think what I was authorized to tell Tariq Aziz in Geneva perhaps saved a lot of angst and casualties for our forces in Desert Storm.
Ryan?
One second, let me get to...
I wasn't quite as sanguine as Jim about when we decided force would be used, because I didn't realize Saddam would be so dumb. Really. Had Saddam early in December, for example, when we had completed our buildup, said, okay, I'll withdraw, then what would we do? We couldn't keep a force there. It's too big to rotate. we would have been in a very difficult position unless he would agree to dismantle his forces, which was highly unlikely. So I kept thinking he would wise up at the end, especially when, Jim hasn't mentioned this, in December, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze resigned. And I think inside the Kremlin, that tended to tip the balance a little, because one of Gorbachev's other advisors, Primakov, was the principal advisor on Iraq. And so I thought there was even a better chance that the Soviets may put more kind of pressure than they tried just before.
And he resigned because he felt that Gorbachev was not protecting him sufficiently against the hardliners.
That's right.
That's exactly why.
I would like to comment on sanction. Always we are asked why you did not, just keep on keeping the sanctions, so though it is so tight and affecting the people of Iraq. The response to that was, people thought that it was a static occupation. It's contrary. It was a very, very brutal, active occupation in Kuwait. The pillaging, the killing, massacring, the theft was all over Kuwait. Therefore, the people of Kuwait were suffering. How we will be able to just give more chances to the Iraqis. And don't forget that Iraq were not, the majority of the Iraqis were not suffering from the sanction, because already for more than 10 years, they were under a de facto sanction by the regime, going into war from war and internal, wars with north to south. And therefore, the fact that sanction could change the mentality of Saddam Hussein, we were really doubt about it. But also we were a little bit skeptical how people will consider that we will able to live with another month, another 2 months of occupation. Had it been just any occupation like history has taught us, India, Pakistan, it could have been different. When we went to Kuwait immediately after liberation, there was no home for even the leadership from Kuwait. His Highness the Amir, he did not go to his house. The Crown Prince, the ministers, because everything was looted and destroyed. This should have been taken in mind concerning the people whom I say, why you did not give more time for sanction?
It was a vicious occupation, as every member of this panel has said, and as the President has said repeatedly, both then and subsequently. But I wasn't going to ask Ambassador Abul Hassan what he thought the right time to shift from sanctions to force was, because I know the answer, August 2nd.
Follow up on this chemical issue, if I may. That was the one issue by December, January that kept me awake at night. We trained, we were prepared for them to abuse them, but our casualties could have been significant if they had decided to use chemical weapons. Was asked every time I talked to a reporter, what about chemical weapons? And my answer was always, they wouldn't dare use them because we would destroy the regime, we'd destroy Baghdad. Now, I had no idea that the secretary had said that, but I was thinking, God, I hope somebody said that to these guys.
Secretary Baker, yes.
And of course, he had.
On the, again, on the military side, General Powell, in an after-action review a few years after Desert Storm, you were quoted as saying, "We fought Desert Storm with the European army. We used European tactics." What did you mean by that?
We had been training for most of my military career and Walt's military career to fight the Soviet Union on the central plains of Europe. Our tanks, our helicopters, our fighter planes, everything was geared toward an air-land battle that reflected an enemy that looked like the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union. And so when Desert Storm came along, especially in the second phase, the second buildup, which was most of the corps that was in Europe, we just brought all of that training, all that equipment, all of that investment to a place where a Soviet-like army was waiting for us. and that was the Iraqi army. So I like to call it, it was the Cold War battle without trees or hills. We were out there in the desert. I remember one American general who had been retired for some time telling me, it won't work, your troops are going to go out there and get lost in the desert. And I just smiled because he hadn't heard about GPS yet. And we hadn't much GPS. We went to every Radio Shack in America buying GPS receivers to outfit our troops. But it was reflective of the kind of technology that we also took there. Apache helicopters, M1A1 tanks, cruise missiles. It was fascinating to watch.
Except for the Marines, who only got M60s.
Well,
that's another long story we don't want to go into.
But as it turned out, the M60 was capable of defeating that Soviet tank.
But we were dealing with an incompetent, frankly, it was an incompetent set of generals who were running the Iraqi army. I mean, they just sat there and watched this all happen, and they didn't respond to it in the slightest.
You stay with that theme for a minute, and we touched on this briefly at lunch. The Iraqi operation at Khafji, of course, General Boomer was there. End of January 29th was about then. In a sense, the Iraqis started the ground war. We didn't with that incursion. Some commentators have said that looking at how the Iraqis carried out that operation, and then when you pushed back, how quickly they moved north, including their Republican Guard units. Some commentators have said we should have had an aha moment as we looked 3 weeks ahead to thinking these guys are going to be making fast tracks backwards. We'd better be making real fast tracks forwards and on the flanks. Two questions. Was there reflection on what Khafji showed us about Iraqi capabilities and tactics? And if there was, what conclusions you drew both in the field and at headquarters?
Well, I watched this Khafji thing unfold, and to be quite truthful, I did not understand or believe, and our intelligence didn't reflect this, that it was a major effort on their part. Because I kept thinking, this is not very smart for them to do. Because we can push them back, and if they attempt to come further down the coast into Saudi Arabia, they're not going to stand a chance. So we working with the Saudi coalition and helping them, were able to push them back pretty quickly. We were not alarmed. I was never alarmed. The Saudis were upset that they had come across and were actually in Saudi territory. That was important to them. But from a military perspective, what we learned was this. If they had their nose bloodied in round one, they were not anxious to come back for round two. That was very important for us to learn, and that battle really helped clarify things in our mind about what might unfold. But we weren't so brilliant as to have been able to deduce that, oh yes, you know, they're going to cave in immediately and we should go.
This is an issue that does not come up often in reflections on the Gulf War, but was absolutely central in an earlier crisis, and that's hostages. The hostage crisis in Iran, many argue, virtually destroyed the Carter presidency. We had hostages in Iraq and Kuwait, human shields, so-called, a lot of publicity at the time, a lot of dramatic gestures by individuals opposed to the war to call attention to it. Yet it did not emerge as a central issue, not just because Saddam let them go in December, but even coming up to December. How do you think that came about? What was the decision to in Washington in terms of handling a hostage issue that kept it from taking over the entire crisis as it did to us in Iran?
I think my own view was that it was a factor, we were aware of it, but we had bigger fish to fry. I mean, we had a major operation that we were planning, and you never got to the point where all you're concerned about are a handful of American hostages. Obviously, you'd be concerned about them, but we weren't about to walk away from the bigger issues that were at stake here that Brent's talked about in terms of the worldwide situation, the United Nations resolutions, the desire of 170-some nations to see this terrible event reversed. And as our Kuwaiti friend talked about, there was an ongoing loss of life from the activities of the Iraqis, and it was important for us to get that resolved as quickly as possible, not to withhold action or hold up to negotiate over a handful of individuals.
We spent a lot of time looking at contingency plans, particularly with respect to the people who were in Kuwait. Getting into Baghdad would have been much more difficult. We could never find anything that would work and might perhaps end up being like a Desert One that President Carter went through, where we not only destroyed the force going in, but got the hostages killed. So it was a difficult decision. We just had to accept that the hostages might become casualties.
I can remember a discussion, Colin, we looked at the possibility of a rescue operation. And in the end, we rejected the rescue operation because we were afraid the Iraqis would interpret that as the beginning of offensive action. And if that's what you were going to do, you needed to have a broader, better developed plan, a lot more forces involved. So we wrote off the idea.
We worried about it, and we worried about them, of course. And had they been mistreated, if they'd been physically mistreated or something, it might have triggered more of a focus on our part, but our primary objective were, as Dick indicated, the bigger issues that we were dealing with as long as they were not being mistreated. And then ultimately, of course, he came to his senses and released them. But it was it gave you a clear picture of the kind of opponents you were dealing with. And spoke to the brutality of his occupation of Kuwait, an extraordinarily brutal occupation.
In Arab world, some of us, of allied forces, when we were faced with the hostage, they said that this is a tactic from Saddam Hussein to divert the attention from the core of the issue. To create some side issues and to let the administration to concentrate on the side issues and forget the main issues. And we remember that even Arafat at that time, who was very close to Saddam Hussein, he has been advised by Saddam Hussein to let him to have some skirmish with the Israelis in West Bank and in Gaza in order to call for a Security Council, because for the first time we have witnessed, thanks God, that from 2nd of August until the liberation of Kuwait, not a single meeting for Security Council has taken place in any other issue but an issue of Kuwait. Though usually, as everybody knows, Secretary Baker, he knows that each month we used to have 2 or 3 meetings calling for discussing settlement or the main issue. But thanks God, from the 2nd of August until after the liberation of Kuwait, Security Council was seized only, I said only, by the issue of Kuwait and some renewals of, observers or, peacekeeping forces, the automatic renewal.
Our time is short, and one very important aspect that we really don't have time to talk about, but I would note it, the issue of Israel, American-Israeli diplomacy as Iraq launched its Scud attacks, our ability to persuade Israel to stay out of the fight, again, not often remarked on now, but in my estimation, an absolutely critical moment in this whole campaign. In the few minutes we have left, I'd like to turn to those 100 fateful hours from several perspectives. General Boomer, I'd like to hear, you were there. You made the run to Kuwait. Your perspective on that. And then from others, looking back 20 years, did the 100 hours give us what we needed? Did we use them all in the right way? Was the 7th Corps too slow? Did too much of the Republican Guard get away? Recognizing that it was not our mission to annihilate the Iraqi army, as was said this morning, with a powerful Iran next door, it would not have served our interests. But more of it get away than we would have liked as you looked at it in retrospect. And the final point of this, the insurrections by first the Shia and the Kurds. As you look back 20 years, would you have recommended we have done anything differently with respect to those two events? Big question, and I know all of you can handle it all in, say, about 7 minutes. So.
Well, can I speak to what might have been done differently, even though it was in the military realm? But it was the political leadership had a role to play in it. I think it would have been very good if we had required Saddam Hussein himself to come to Safwan and sign the surrender documents. I think we should have done that. And then I think it probably was a mistake for us to let him fly his helicopters, allegedly to reposition some of the people that we were shooting as they fled the highway of death. I think that might have been a mistake. But except for those two things, I have to tell you, as I said earlier, I think this is a textbook example of the way to go to war, diplomatically, politically, and by that I mean politically within the United States, and getting the consent of both houses of Congress. Militarily, of course, by virtue of the way we handle that job so expeditiously and with minimum casualties, and economically, in the sense that a lot of other countries contributed treasure to this effort.
I would just add, I agree with that. I would just add that on the uprisings, the Shia and the Kurds, we did not want Iraq to split apart because we were still thinking of the geopolitics of the region and Iraq and Iran offsetting each other. So that was a prime consideration in what we did about those insurrections.
Concerning Kuwait, though, I mean, the Kuwaiti people would have really loved that the 100 hours could have been extended 10 more hours to just go and get rid of him in Baghdad. But nevertheless, being from, I mean, speaking from the United Nations and knowing what is, I mean, how we were able to generate that international solid support. Had we gone to that option, maybe we could have lost all, I mean, the sense of victory which you have achieved, and we really proudly joined you. But I do agree with Secretary Baker that in Safwan, here was the core of the issue. Had higher than Hashim, who was the general staff, it seems to me by that time, to sign the ceasefire. Higher than him, Minister of Defense, or it would be really very hard to ask Saddam Hussein himself at that time. He would be prolonging the issue and people would be demanding that any ceasefire should be signed by military people. Therefore, that issue really, I do agree with you. We wished that higher than the one who already signed, who was Chief General Staff.
Some seem surprised that we were able to do this in 3 days. I actually was not, because I knew if we could breach this barrier, cross these minefields, it wasn't going to take us long. And because we didn't have far to go. And once we blew through there with 2 divisions, they weren't going to be able to stop us. So I think the speed surprised some, but it really didn't surprise us. In the last conversation that I had with General Schwarzkopf over the radio, I was almost at the Iraqi border, and I told him where I was, and I said, we're poised to launch for Basra, and we will police up the rest of these folks if you want us to. And he said, stand by. And then the next message that I received was not directly from him, but through my headquarters, that we had in fact stopped.
I think this is an issue that will be discussed for many years to come, and I think there's a legitimate argument you can have as to whether we stopped too soon or not. But on balance, we had accomplished the mission. The Iraqi army was fleeing, and it's easy to say, well, you should have just kept killing them. But this was an army that we did not want to totally destroy. And I think President Bush made the right decision after getting the recommendations from us and asking General Schwarzkopf to give us his recommendation if stopping was acceptable. And he said, yes, it was. And he had just announced on television that he thought it was time to end the war. I think we did the right thing. The Shia and Kurd uprisings were unfortunate. And it wasn't just attack helicopters that stopped those uprisings. He still had an army. There wasn't more than roughly 50, at most 55% of the Iraqi army in the Kuwait theater. The rest of them were still in Iraq. So they could control that population. And there should have been no illusion on our part that the Marsh Shia would ever have the capacity to split off from the rest of Iraq or to march on Baghdad. So we really could not get involved in that. And I think we accomplished the mission, and we did it in a way that tried to minimize loss of human life on both our sides. And the Iraqi side of these conscripts who had no choice but to be there, mostly Shias, forced into the service, fighting an all-volunteer force. The United States is one of the best we've ever fielded.
I don't have as strong a memory as some of my colleagues do, Ryan, that we were concerned about saving part of the Iraqi army. I felt it turned more at the end of the 100 hours. We'd done what we said we were going to do. We'd done a masterful job, as Jim said, on all these different dimensions, but that there was also a strong feeling, and Colin just touched on it, that this magnificent force had done a tremendous job, and that we'd reached the point where the Iraqis were so weak that it was just a question of, did we really want to ask our young men and women to continue to slaughter the enemy? And it was that kind of equation where there was no military rationale why we would want to continue to do that, given the fact that we'd already achieved our objective. And then it was that kind of thinking more than this question of, do you want to keep part of the Iraqi army for some purpose?
This was one issue with respect to which all of the president's political advisors and military advisors were in accord. I remember the telephone conversation with General Schwarzkopf there in the Oval. I was on one of the extensions, and everybody recommended to the president that the mission had been accomplished and it was time to end it. I want to say one quick comment, if I might, Ryan, about your statement about the Scuds into Israel. This was a really serious, complicating factor. Israel has never failed to respond to any attack on it, and yet had she sent airplanes up to try to take out some of those Scud missile batteries in western Iraq or anywhere else, and it would have greatly complicated the military and political mission that we were on. And we made an appeal, and Dick was getting a lot of pressure from the Israeli Minister of Defense to permit them to retaliate by giving them the deconfliction codes for aircraft and so forth. And we really seriously didn't want that, and we ended up talking to Prime Minister Shamir himself. I talked to him, I'm sure some others did, but to his everlasting credit, he overruled other members of his cabinet and said, no, he said, we should not complicate our American friends' efforts in this regard. We said we're going to do a lot more to take care of those Patriot, I mean Scud missile batteries, and we did. And General Schwarzkopf diverted additional forces there. But I think we need to recognize that our Israeli friends really were solid with us on that issue, and particularly Prime Minister Shamir, because he alone, I think, among his closest advisors, were willing to see the bigger picture.
I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Clearly, we could go on for hours. It has been a unique opportunity for all of us to sit down with the men who, under the leadership of President Bush and Vice President Quayle, literally transformed the world we live in, and to hear your unique accounts of just how you did it. So please, all of you, join me in thanking some truly great Americans. This is not quite the end of the program. American fighting men and women through the history of this country, seats please, have gone off to fight our nation's battles with courage, optimism, conviction, and enthusiasm. And since our Revolutionary War, they've also done it always with music, not just, you know, the national anthem and the patriotic marches, the popular music of an era that captures a soldier's heart as he goes into combat. There was such a song for Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I think almost all of you know it. It's called Proud to be an American. It was sung every single day at General Schwarzkopf's headquarters in Saudi Arabia and throughout the theater. And tonight, we are extremely privileged that the man who wrote and made that song famous, Lee Greenwood, is here to sing it for us tonight. So let us all give him a huge hand.
If tomorrow all the things were gone, worked for all my life, and I had to start again, just my children and my wife. Thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston and New York to LA, where there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say that I'm proud to be the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the program. We'd ask that you please remain in the auditorium until the President's party has departed in that really flashy AM mobile.